12 beavers were found living inside a dead drainage canal in Great Britain, and the government had no record of how they got there. For 4 centuries, this island had run its water without them. The rivers had been straightened, the canals cemented, the floodplains tamed by parliamentary act and engineering mandate. Every major waterway had been redesigned to move water away from people as fast as possible, and the system had held officially for generations. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how 12 animals, operating without authorization, without a budget, and without a single planning approval, built a hydrological infrastructure that outperformed the Council's multi-million-pound flood defense assets. And it will permanently change how you read any government report that tells you a problem requires a capital project to solve. Here is the detail that does not fit the official story. The beavers were not released by a rewilding charity. They were not part of a licensed government trial. They arrived through a coordinated, clandestine operation executed by a shadow network of conservationists who had spent years watching regulatory committees adjourn without a decision and decided to stop waiting. That is where this story begins. Britain's post-war drainage network was not a loose collection of local waterways. It was a centrally administered hydraulic grid, maintained by statutory internal drainage boards operating under direct parliamentary mandate, with legal authority to survey and modify any watercourse within their jurisdiction at any time. Every significant channel was logged. Every flow rate was monitored. Every biological anomaly was, in theory, immediately flagged. The system was not just engineered, it was watched. Which makes the Devon Field audit of 2008 one of the more extraordinary administrative failures in modern British environmental history. A routine inspection of a low-priority channel in the River Otter catchment, formerly classified as ecologically degraded, flagged for no active monitoring, returned results the survey team initially attributed to equipment error. The water table had shifted. Sediment loads were dropping. Flow velocities in a channel with no active gradient management had measurably slowed. And then 3 meters from the bank, the surveyor found a dam built from locally sourced willow, structurally sound, recently reinforced. No permit, no contractor, no entry record. Behind it, a second dam. Behind that, a third. A distributed network of interlocking timber structures, each one positioned to slow, pool, and redirect flow at a different point in the system, not randomly, but with a geometric logic that the Environment Agency's own flood engineers would later describe, on record, as non-trivially optimal. 12 animals. 0 planning approvals. An infrastructure footprint that no authorized project had produced in 40 years of committee meetings. While bureaucratic boards spent years deadlocked in administrative committees debating how to manage collapsing river channels, a shadow network had executed a midnight tactical maneuver, and its workforce had 4 teeth, a flat tail, and absolutely no interest in the planning register. The initial government response was not celebration, it was a removal order, because these animals had no legal standing, no permit, no approved management plan. The property had not consented. And then the autumn rain came, and what the flood monitoring data showed forced an entirely different conversation. Calibrating a structural infiltration of this magnitude requires pinning down our exact geographic baseline. Log your specific state, province, or drainage basin in the comments below, noting whether your regional river corridors are currently tracking under heavy industrial stagnation or active biological recovery. If you believe this hidden data map needs to reach more analytical minds, authorize a share of this post right now. Let's return directly to the canal gates, because these 12 rodents were about to rewrite the Crown's property manual. Because the Drainage Board could not yet answer the question that made stopping impossible: who put them there, and how long had they been building? The state treated the landscape as an asset to be mapped and channelized, but the animals looked at the dead canal as a blank canvas. To understand why that distinction matters, you need to sit with what Britain's drainage infrastructure actually cost and what it consistently failed to deliver. Between 1980 and 2010, the Environment Agency and its predecessor bodies invested upwards of £30 billion in flood defence infrastructure across England and Wales. Concrete weirs, steel sluice gates, dredged straightened channels designed to evacuate water from the land before it could pool, before it could seep, before it could cause liability. The logic was clean and the engineering was sound. The results were not. Topsoil loss across lowland agricultural basins accelerated. Nitrate runoff into downstream waterways increased. And every time a major storm event exceeded the design threshold of the concrete infrastructure, which, by the early 2000s, was happening with measurable regularity, the water went exactly where it always had: into the villages, into the fields, into the insurance claims. The problem was not that the engineers were incompetent. The problem was that the system they had built was structurally incapable of learning. Every new flood triggered a new impact assessment. Every assessment produced a consultation. Every consultation deferred to the next planning cycle. According to Environment Agency internal review documents published in 2012, the average time from flood event identification to approved remediation project in lowland England was 6 years. 6 years from the point of documented failure to the point of authorized response. The Beavers on the River Otter did not wait 6 years. They did not wait 6 months. Working nocturnally, using materials already present in the Channel corridor, they began modifying the hydrology of that dead drainage reach within weeks of arrival, stabilizing sediment, raising the local water table, and creating a series of retention pools that would, within 2 seasons, begin functioning as passive storm buffers. Not because anyone designed it, not because anyone approved it. Because that is what a beaver does when you place it next to water and leave it alone. Deconstructing a generational infrastructure failure of this scale requires an audience prepared to follow the data wherever it leads. If that is why you are here, secure your position in this research network by hitting the subscribe button now, and if this diagnostic is landing, drop a like to push this file through the algorithmic filter. Now follow the timeline straight into the hydrological monitoring logs, because the moment the heavy autumn rains arrived, the telemetry broke the state's flood models. Because by the time the Environment Agency formally acknowledged the river otter population in 2014, the beavers had been operating inside their drainage grid, undetected and unimpeded, for the better part of 6 years. And the flood data from those 6 years had already been collected. It was sitting in the monitoring logs, and no one had yet looked at what it showed. The Regional Council expected a destructive, invasive nuisance, but when the automated hydrological data cleared, the metrics shattered the entire state engineering paradigm. The University of Exeter's 2020 peer-reviewed analysis of the river otter beaver population is not a conservation report. It is a performance audit, and the numbers it contains are not marginal. Peak storm flow downstream of the Beaver Dam network, reduced by 30%, not slowed, reduced. Sediment capture across the dam matrix, over 1 ton per dam per year, removing agricultural nitrogen and phosphorus loads that the council's concrete infrastructure had never intercepted. Total estimated avoided flood damage to downstream properties across the trial period, in the millions. 12 animals, no budget, no planning approval, no contractor invoice. 30%. Think about what that number represents. The Environment Agency had spent decades and billions engineering toward that threshold and never reached it. 12 beavers reached it for free in under a decade using sticks. Not improved concrete, not upgraded sluice technology, sticks. But that is not the most disturbing part of what the data showed, because buried inside the Exeter report was a secondary finding, one that the council's drainage engineers had not anticipated and could not immediately explain, and it had nothing to do with flood volumes. But here is where the victory turned into an absolute administrative nightmare for the Crown. The biological argument had one meaning: the state was now legally trapped by its own legal definitions. The public assumption, entirely reasonable given the data, was that the British government would absorb the Exeter findings, declare quiet institutional success, and move forward with a managed expansion program. That is not what happened. What happened instead was a coordinated counteroffensive. The Country Land and Business Association, representing the interests of private landowners across England and Wales, formally demanded removal. Internal drainage boards filed liability notices. Agricultural stakeholders submitted legal challenges citing unauthorized modification of watercourses under the Land Drainage Act 1991. The position of the landowning establishment was straightforward. These animals had no legal right to be there. Their structures constituted unauthorized alterations to private and managed watercourses, and the state had both the mandate and the obligation to remove them. The government's legal team began drafting the removal order, and then someone read the habitat's regulations. The beaver dams had, by 2014, created a functioning wetland ecosystem. Riparian vegetation had recolonized the channel margins. Invertebrate populations had recovered to levels not recorded in that catchment in decades. Water voles, a legally protected species under Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, had moved in. Under both European and domestic environmental law, the deliberate destruction of an established habitat supporting protected species constituted a criminal offense. The dams could not be removed without destroying that habitat. Destroying that habitat would violate the very statutes the state itself had enacted. The animals that had arrived without permission had, in 6 years of nocturnal engineering, wrapped themselves in so many layers of legal protection that the removal order became legally unenforceable. Not difficult, not politically inconvenient, unenforceable. This profound divergence between where a species is permitted to exist and where its biology actually thrives is actively throwing global restoration frameworks into chaos. For those of you mapping this footprint across regions testing introduced aquatic stock or assisted species migration, document your specific anomalies in the comments below. If this data deserves a wider audience, take a second to share this file directly to your network. Look closely at the final legal and administrative invoice for this distributed survival matrix, because what the government was forced to do next has no precedent in British wildlife law. Because the question the state now faced was not whether to accept the beavers. It was how to explain, in formal statutory language, how an animal that arrived illegally, built without permission, and colonized without consent had just forced a sovereign government to rewrite its own legal framework and call it conservation policy. The litigation proved what the concrete couldn't. The map lines are completely artificial, but the hydrology is absolute. In 2022, the British government formally designated the Eurasian beaver a native species under English law and granted the river otter population permanent legal protection. Not a trial population, not a managed experiment. A legally recognized, permanently protected native resident, an animal whose ancestors had been absent from this landscape for 400 years, whose reintroduction had never been officially sanctioned, and whose presence had been actively contested by the state for over a decade. The government did not celebrate the decision. It published it quietly in the language of administrative updates and moved on. 12 animals, no budget, no mandate, 30% flood reduction, millions in avoided damage, a functioning wetland where a dead canal had been, water voles, riparian vegetation, and at the end of it, a complete rewrite of British wildlife law. The question is no longer whether unauthorized rewilding works. The question is what it means that it took an illegal act to prove it. Because if the data from Devon is accurate, and it has been peer-reviewed, replicated, and formally adopted into government policy, then every committee that deferred, every impact assessment that stalled, every removal order that was drafted represents not caution, but cost, measured in flood damage, in topsoil, in the downstream chemistry of water that billions of people drink. The institutional framework did not protect the land, it protected itself. And the animals that bypassed it did not just outperform a drainage board. They exposed the central fiction of modern conservation, that the problem is always biological and the solution always requires permission. That pattern does not end in Devon. We turn next to a remote mountain valley in the Canadian wilderness, a high-altitude ecosystem where a century of absolute species absence had completely unraveled the vegetation grids and migration corridors that once defined it. Conservation teams bypassed decades of standard monitoring forecasts and executed a high-stakes remote translocation. Canada released 28 bison into a valley that hadn't seen one in 100 years. What those animals did next, the dormant genetic maps they activated, the river channels they modified, the biodiversity explosion that blindsided North American wildlife management boards, makes everything in this file look like a warm-up. We open that case next. If our existing frameworks are trapping ecological recovery inside static legal borders that actively contradict what the biology demands, the entire global rulebook is obsolete. Drop your definitive analysis on assisted migration below alongside your home coordinate, and if this investigation has fundamentally shifted how you read conservation policy, leave a like and secure your subscription to Earth Discovery. Because the map said beavers belonged to history, the hydrology disagreed.